He had built an empire on silence and fear. Kang Tae-hyun didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In Seoul's criminal underworld, one look from him was enough to make grown men forget their own names. 32 years old, untouchable, and completely hollow inside. A man who had mastered the art of having everything while feeling nothing. Now his father was forcing him to marry a stranger. And somewhere across the city, a woman who had been quietly watching him for years was about to walk into his world and destroy every wall he had ever built. This is the story no one expected. And it begins tonight. If this story already has you, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments below, and follow along. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The boardroom on the 47th floor of KTH Holdings smelled like leather and cold air, and the particular kind of silence that only existed when Kang Tae-hyun was about to speak. I was standing at the window with his back to the room, one hand in his trouser pocket, the other holding a glass of water he hadn't touched. Below him, Seoul spread out in every direction, towers and rivers, and 10 million people who didn't know what moved beneath the surface of this city. Deals signed in rooms that didn't exist. Bodies that disappeared without headlines. Money that washed through clean hands and came out cleaner. Tae-hyun had built most of that. He'd inherited the foundation, yes. Kang Hyun-jae had laid that groundwork over 40 years of calculated ruthlessness. But everything that existed now, the reach, the network, the companies stacked behind shell accounts in cities no one checked. That was Tae-hyun's architecture. He was 32. And he was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Behind him, 3 men sat at the long conference table. His CFO, his head of security, and Park Jun-seo, his personal attorney. None of them spoke until he turned around. "Run it again," Tae-hyun said. Jun-seo cleared his throat and opened the folder. The quarterly numbers for the Busan distribution operation are down 14%. The Port Authority contact we've maintained for 6 years has retired, and his replacement is... I don't care about his replacement. Tae-hyun set the water glass down on the windowsill without looking at it. I care about who replaced the replacement, who put him there, what he owes, and to whom. We're working on work faster. That was it. No raised voice, no table slamming. Just 2 words, quiet and flat, and the room shifted the way rooms always shifted around Tae-hyun, as if the air itself understood the hierarchy. Jun-seo closed the folder. The CFO made a note. The head of security, a heavy-set man named Choi Dae-won, who had been with the organization for 11 years and had never once seen his employer lose his temper in public, stared at the table and kept his expression neutral. Tae-hyun walked to his chair, sat down, and that was when his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. One name, Father. He let it ring twice before he answered. "You're not picking up on the first ring." His father's voice was gravel and disappointment, the way it had always been. "That tells me you're busy pretending I don't exist." "I'm in a meeting." "Then leave it. I need you here. Dinner, 7 o'clock. A pause. "Don't make me call twice." The line went dead. Tae-hyun set the phone face down on the table and looked at his 3 employees. "We're done for the afternoon. Jun-seo, the Busan file on my desk by tomorrow morning." Nobody argued. Nobody asked questions. They collected their things and left. The Kang family home sat on a hillside in Seongbuk-dong, behind walls and trees that had stood for 30 years. It wasn't the largest property Tae-hyun owned. He had a penthouse downtown that he preferred, a villa in Jeju he visited once a year and ignored the rest of the time. But this house had always felt like a place where things were decided rather than lived. His mother had died in a bedroom on the 2nd floor. He had grown up in the halls beneath portraits of ancestors he'd never met. The garden was immaculate and permanently empty. He arrived at 6:58. His father was already at the table. Kang Hyun-jae was 67 and looked 55. A man who had spent his entire adult life in rooms where he held power tended to carry himself that way. Upright, measured, every movement deliberate as though the air around him needed permission to move. He was eating soup when Tae-hyun walked in and didn't look up. "Sit." Tae-hyun sat. A housekeeper appeared with a second bowl. He didn't touch it. "You know why I called you here," his father said. "It wasn't a question." "I can guess." "Then guess." Tae-hyun looked at him across the table. The chandelier above them threw warm light over fine china and silverware, and the same cold distance that had existed between these two men for as long as Tae-hyun could remember. His father had never been cruel, exactly. He had simply never been warm. There was a distinction there, and Tae-hyun had spent most of his childhood trying to figure out if it mattered. It did. He knew that now. "You want me married," Tae-hyun said. Hyunji set his spoon down and looked up for the first time. "I want the organization protected. Our allies in the financial sector have been watching. There are men who look at an unmarried heir to this empire and see instability, vulnerability." His voice was even, dispassionate, as if he were discussing property insurance. "You are 32. You have built an impressive machine, but a machine without succession planning is a machine with an expiration date. I'm 32, not 70. I was 31 when I married your mother." His father reached for his water glass. "I didn't love her. You know that. She didn't love me. But we were a unit. And a unit is harder to threaten than a single man." Tae-hyun kept his face still. This was a skill he had learned early, holding everything inside where it couldn't be used as leverage. "Who?" "There is a woman, an American, Black American, raised in Atlanta, but living in Seoul for the past 4 years. Her name is Imani Brooks. She runs a fashion consultancy that has worked with 4 of our subsidiary companies in a legitimate business capacity. Her background has been checked thoroughly. She has no criminal associations, no problematic family entanglements, no history that could create complications." "You've already vetted her." "I've been thorough. You've already made a decision." Hyunjae didn't answer right away. He picked up his spoon and stirred his soup slowly, and that deliberate quiet said everything a direct answer would have. Tae-hyun felt something move in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something between the two that he'd never found a word for. "I want to meet her first," Tae-hyun said. "Naturally. Alone. That can be arranged. And if I refuse—" His father set the spoon down again and looked at him with eyes that had calculated 1,000 outcomes in 1,000 rooms, and always come back to the same conclusion. Sentiment was a liability that serious men couldn't afford. "Then I will begin the restructuring of the inheritance trust," Hyunjae said. "The board will be informed that you are unavailable for the transition of primary leadership. My brother's son is 28 and eager. Cousin Sungwoo." A man Tae-hyun had watched grow up spineless and hungry and perfectly willing to smile at anyone who could give him what he wanted. "You'd give it to Seung-woo." "I would give it to whoever keeps this family intact." His father's voice didn't change. "I'm not threatening you, Tae-hyun. I'm telling you the shape of the world as it is." Tae-hyun stood. He didn't flip the table, didn't knock his untouched bowl to the floor, didn't give his father even the smallest satisfaction of visible emotion. He buttoned his jacket. "Set up the meeting," he said, and he left. He didn't sleep that night. He stood on the balcony of his downtown penthouse with a cigarette he'd lit and forgotten, watching the city below, and tried to locate the exact perimeter of what he was willing to do. The problem was that the perimeter kept moving. He'd walked away from the family home at 18 with the understanding that everything he built would be his own. Not a gift, not an inheritance, a construction. He'd spent 14 years laying every brick of that construction himself, often alone, sometimes in ways that would never survive public scrutiny. And now his father, who had watched all of it, who had benefited from the networks and resources Tae-hyun had developed and expanded, his father was dangling it like a prize to be earned or revoked. The worst part wasn't the ultimatum. The worst part was that it worked. He took a pull from the cigarette, exhaled slowly, and tried to picture the woman his father had described. Imani Brooks. A name that didn't fit into any category he already had. He pulled up his phone and typed it into the search engine. Professional curiosity, not personal, he told himself, and found her quickly enough. A website for her consultancy, a portfolio of work with clean, confident design sensibility, a professional photo on the About page. She was looking at the camera directly. Brown eyes, natural hair pulled up, a slight smile that wasn't performing warmth and wasn't performing seriousness either. Just a woman looking at a lens without any particular effort to be anything other than what she was. He studied the photo longer than he intended. Then he closed the browser and went inside. She'd been awake since 5. Imani Brooks had been awake since 5 because she'd received a phone call at 4:47 from a number she didn't recognize, and a voice that identified itself as representing the Kong family, and whatever sleep had remained after that was not coming back. She was sitting at her kitchen counter in her apartment in Mapogu, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, going over the conversation in her mind for the fourth time. A meeting request, they'd said. A business matter of a personal nature, they'd said. An invitation to lunch at a private venue tomorrow noon with Kang Tae-hyun himself. The name was not unfamiliar to her. She'd first seen him 3 years ago at a benefit gala hosted by one of Seoul's largest conglomerates. She'd been there through a client connection, wearing borrowed earrings and trying to figure out how a consultancy from Atlanta, by way of a cramped studio apartment in Mapo, made sense in a room full of inherited wealth and deliberate power. She'd been standing near the edge of the room with a glass of champagne she wasn't drinking when she'd noticed him across the crowd. Not because he was the most physically striking man present, though he wasn't difficult to look at. He was tall, dark-haired, dressed in a way that suggested the clothes had been built specifically for that body, which they probably had. She'd noticed him because of the expression, or rather the absence of one. Everyone else at that gala was performing something: confidence, generosity, casualness, importance. The social contract of the very wealthy was that you wore your success like a costume and expected everyone around you to recognize the brand. Kang Tae-hyun was just standing there, not performing, not playing. He was in the room the way a room is in a building, structurally present but somehow separate from everything alive around it. She'd sketched him later that night from memory. Just his profile, the slight angle of his chin, the line of his jaw. She hadn't known why at the time. She'd told herself it was purely compositional interest, the instinct of someone who'd spent years studying visual proportion and the way bodies occupied space. That was 3 years ago. 12 sketches later, she was less convinced it was purely compositional, and now someone from his family was asking her to lunch. She poured the rest of the coffee down the drain and started getting dressed. The venue was a private dining room on the second floor of a hotel in Gangnam that didn't advertise itself online. There was no signage. A car had been sent for her. She arrived 2 minutes early, which was deliberate, because Imani Brooks did not walk into rooms she hadn't prepared herself for. She was wearing a deep green dress, her own design, tailored 3 months ago for a client showcase but never worn in public, and her hair was down. She had considered pulling it up, decided that felt like armor, and left it. If she was going to walk into something she didn't fully understand, she was going to walk in as herself. Tae-hyun was already there. I was standing when she entered, which surprised her. He was at the far end of the table looking at his phone, and he looked up the moment the door opened. She watched him put the phone in his pocket. The motion was smooth, automatic, the reflex of a man who didn't keep things in his hands longer than necessary. And he studied her in the space of a single second with the kind of comprehensive assessment that other men took 5 minutes to pretend they weren't doing. "Ms. Brooks," he said. "Mr. Kang." They sat at the same time, across from each other, with about 4 feet of white linen and crystal glassware and a centerpiece between them. A waiter materialized, poured water, and vanished. Tae-hyun said nothing for a moment. She held the silence. "You came," he said finally. "I was invited." "You weren't told why. That would have been reason enough for most people to decline." "I was told it was a business matter of a personal nature," she said, "which is vague enough to mean almost anything. I figured it was worth the curiosity." Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but a slight recalibration, as if she'd said something slightly unexpected. He reached for his water glass. "My father wants me married. He suggested you." She absorbed that. She absorbed it with her hands in her lap, and her face level, and her breathing steady, because Imani had spent 4 years living in a city where she was always the outsider, the only black woman in the room at every important meeting, the American who didn't fully belong to either world she moved between. And she had learned a very long time ago that the moment you showed someone your surprise was the moment they understood the exact depth of your preparation. "I see," she said. "He's provided me with a file on your background, your business, your personal history." He said it flatly, not apologetically, the way you might mention a tax filing. "I've read it." "Of course you have. This is the part where I ask you questions." "Then ask." He looked at her. Not through her, not past her, at her. She'd spent enough time studying people, drawing them, observing the microarchitecture of attention and intention and how a person directed their eyes, to know the difference. He wasn't performing this evaluation. He was actually doing it. "Why are you still in Seoul?" he asked. "Because my business is here." "You could run a consultancy from anywhere. You were profitable in Atlanta before you moved." "You've read a thorough file." "I asked a thorough question." She tilted her head slightly. I came here because Seoul challenged me. The design culture, the intersection of tradition and forward-looking aesthetics, the market complexity. It was more interesting than anything I was building at home. I stayed because I built something real here, and because going back felt like going backward. A pause. And personal reasons? Not any I'm obligated to share in a first conversation with a stranger. He almost smiled. She wasn't sure, but the corners of his mouth moved in a way that suggested the machinery for smiling was present even if it rarely ran. Fair, he said. The waiter returned. They ordered without consulting each other about preferences, which Imani thought said something. She ordered the grilled fish. He ordered nothing, just asked for the menu to be cleared, which seemed to be a communication she'd missed, because the waiter simply nodded and removed everything. I'll be direct with you, Taehyun said, when they were alone again. I don't want to get married. I'm doing this because the alternative is watching 14 years of work handed to someone who will destroy it in 18 months out of incompetence and ego. That's very honest. There's no benefit in pretending otherwise. If we do this, I'm not going to pretend it's anything other than what it is. A business arrangement. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light came in at an angle through the window at the far end of the room and landed in the space between them and turned the air faintly gold. She thought about the sketch she'd done 3 years ago. The profile, the absence of expression, the particular quality of his stillness. And what do I get, she said. Resources, access. A level of business security and social protection in this city that you currently have to work for twice as hard to earn on your own. You've made this pitch before. I haven't. You sound like someone who has. He looked at her with those eyes that gave away less than a closed door. I've thought about what you would reasonably want to know. She nodded slowly. I'll need to think about it. Naturally. I'll need a week. You have 3 days. My father moves on timelines, not calendars. She stood. He stood with her. That same reflex, the instinct of a man whose formality was so deeply embedded it happened before thought. She held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and dry and entirely impersonal, and his hand was warm, and she noticed that in the way she noticed everything and filed it away in the part of her brain that never stopped drawing. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he agreed. She left first. She made sure of it. The 3 days were the longest she'd had in Seoul. She told her assistant she was taking meetings off-site and spent the first day reorganizing her entire apartment as if she were preparing to move, pulling things off shelves, examining objects she'd accumulated, cataloging the weight of the life she'd built here. It was a thinking process she'd had since childhood, the need to handle things when a decision was forming. She called her older sister in Atlanta on the second day. So you're considering marrying a mob boss, her sister Anaya said, with the measured tone of someone who had been listening to Imani's life choices for 31 years and had learned to present concern without hysteria. He's technically a business executive. Imani. He runs legitimate companies. I've worked with 3 of them. And the part that isn't legitimate? Imani looked out the window at the Han River in the far distance. There's no part that is explicitly Imani. I know, she said quietly. Do you like him? The question landed somewhere unexpected. She'd been circling all the practical considerations: security, opportunity, the risk calculus of agreeing to a legal arrangement with a man whose empire had edges she couldn't see, and she hadn't let herself land on that particular piece of ground. I've seen him a few times, at events, over the years. She kept her voice even. I was curious about him. That's not what I asked. I know. A long pause. The sound of her sister moving through her kitchen on the other side of the world. The particular background noise of a life that had stayed tethered to everything Imani had left behind. You're going to say yes, Anaya said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the voice of someone who knew the answer already. I'm still thinking. You already packed your feelings about him into a mental storage unit the moment you started listing his legitimate business connections. That's what you do when you've already decided and you don't want to admit it yet. Imani was quiet for a moment. He looked at me like he was actually looking, she said finally. Not like he was calculating what I was worth to him or figuring out how to pitch me something. Like he was genuinely trying to see what was there. Anya exhaled. God help you. Maybe. Call me when you've signed whatever terrifying document they put in front of you. Love you. Love you more. Be careful. On the third day, she called the number they'd given her and said yes. The wedding was 4 weeks later. It was not a small affair. Kang Hyun-jae believed in display, in the language of public ceremony, as a message to rivals and allies alike, that the family was consolidated, intentional, unassailable. The venue was a private estate in the hills south of the city. 300 guests who existed in the intersection of legitimate business and the other kind. Flowers that Imani had chosen herself from a shortlist, which had been the one small negotiation she'd won in the weeks of preparation that had otherwise felt like watching someone else's movie from the inside. She stood in front of the full-length mirror in the preparation room and looked at herself in the gown and felt, distantly and unexpectedly, like she was about to walk into a room she couldn't exit the same way she'd entered. Her hair was up. She'd decided in the end that armor was fine. The ceremony was 40 minutes. Tae-hyun stood at the front of the room in a dark suit that had clearly been cut specifically for this occasion, with the same expression she'd seen across the lunch table, present but unrevealing, the face of a man who had made a decision and was executing it without editorializing. He said the words he was supposed to say. She said the words she was supposed to say. The ring was a simple platinum band with a single stone, which she had not expected. She'd expected something ostentatious, a statement piece designed to communicate the family's position. Instead, it was quiet and precise, the way she was learning, slowly, to recognize everything about him. When he slid the ring onto her finger, he looked at her hand for a half-second longer than the ceremony required. She noticed. The reception lasted 4 hours, and Tae-hyun spent most of it doing exactly what was expected of him, moving through the room, greeting guests, conducting the social mathematics of 300 people who needed to leave that night, having felt appropriately acknowledged by the heir of the Kang organization. Imani moved through her own version of the same room. She was introduced to business partners who shook her hand and assessed her in the same 2-second window Tae-hyun had used at the lunch table. She smiled and answered questions and managed the specific kind of social endurance that came from being the only person in a room who understood they were a variable in someone else's equation. They spoke to each other twice during the reception. Once, when she appeared at his elbow during a conversation with 2 men who kept glancing at her with a poorly masked curiosity she recognized as something more complicated than ethnic interest. "My wife," he said, turning to include her with an ease that she had not expected. Not performing pride. He didn't have that kind of performance in him, she was beginning to understand. Just stating a fact. She is here. She is part of this. The men adjusted their expressions and refocused. The second time was near the end of the evening, when she found him alone for a moment near a window at the edge of the main hall. "How are you holding up?" she asked. He looked at her sideways. It was a strange question for him to receive, she could see that. Not a hostile question, not a transactional one, just a straightforward inquiry into his actual state, which was apparently so unusual in his orbit that he didn't immediately know what to do with it. "Fine," he said, after a moment. "I can tell when someone's tired of a room," she said. "You've had the same look for about an hour. And you?" "I'm fine." She looked out the window at the garden lights. "It's a lot of people." "Yes. None of them are looking at us like we've made a horrible decision, at least. They wouldn't, not in this room." "I know. I meant it as a light observation, not a genuine concern." He turned his head to look at her more fully then, and she had the feeling again of being actually seen. That quality she'd tried to describe to her sister, the directness of it, the absence of performance. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He turned back to the window. "Someone easier to categorize." She almost laughed. She didn't, quite. "I'll take that." The car took them to his penthouse at midnight. Their penthouse, she supposed now. The arrangement had included her moving into his residence, another negotiation she had not won, though she'd pushed, and the pushback had told her something about the boundaries she was working within. The penthouse was exactly what she'd predicted from the man. Clean, expensive, stripped of anything personal. Good art on the walls that felt selected by someone with taste, but no sentiment. A kitchen that appeared largely unused. A living room designed for impressiveness rather than comfort. She stood in the center of the main space with her overnight bag and looked around. Tae-hyun loosened his tie and set his jacket over the back of a chair. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was becoming familiar. "There are 3 bedrooms," he said, "all prepared. You can choose whichever you prefer." She looked at him. He had the decency not to make it awkward. He simply stated the fact and waited, which was its own kind of courtesy. Okay, she said. I wake at 5:30. I'm out by 7. There's a staff member who comes at 8 for housekeeping. The kitchen is... He paused, as if only now noticing the gap between what he was saying and the context of the day they'd just had. I'll have a list prepared. Taehyun. He stopped. We just got married, she said. Not accusatory, not emotional, just a statement of fact, the way he tended to operate. I'm not asking for anything from tonight that you're not prepared to give. But we can talk like people. We don't have to operate on a manual. He looked at her for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth, not yet. Nothing that comfortable. But something. A recognition of some kind. I'm not very good at that, he said. I know. She picked up her bag. But I am. So I'll go first, and you can catch up when you're ready. She looked around at the cold and perfect apartment that was now technically her home. The bedroom closest to the window? East side, best light in the morning. She nodded. Good night, then. She walked down the hall. She did not look back. Behind her, in the expensive silence of the main room, Kang Tae-hyun stood perfectly still for a long time after she disappeared, and then sat down in the chair he never used, in the apartment that had never quite felt like his, and stared at the city below, trying to locate the exact shape of the feeling that had just arrived in his chest. It was small. It was unfamiliar. And it unsettled him far more than any threat he'd faced in 14 years of building an empire from the ground up. He didn't sleep well. And 3 rooms away, Imani Brooks lay on top of the unfamiliar sheets and stared at the ceiling and thought about the way he'd said, "She's not what I expected." The flatness of it, the almost reluctant honesty. And in the darkness, just barely, she smiled. Then she closed her eyes. And in the morning, before he was awake, she slipped a single handwritten note under the door of his study. Good morning. I made coffee. There's a cup on the kitchen counter if you want it. She was gone before he found it. He stood in the hallway in his suit, the note in one hand, and the full cup of coffee still warm on the counter. And for the first time in longer than he could honestly account for, he didn't know what to do next. And across the city, in a building he would visit that afternoon with 3 men flanking him and a meeting agenda that would require 2 separate death threats to navigate successfully, a rival was moving pieces on a board that Tae-hyun hadn't fully accounted for, because he'd been spending 3 days thinking about a woman with direct brown eyes and a deep green dress, and the slight movement at the corner of his mouth that she'd almost caused at a white linen table in Gangnam. And now the pieces were moving, and nobody was watching the board. The note was still on his desk 3 days later. He hadn't thrown it away. He hadn't moved it either. It sat in the upper left corner of the leather desk pad, slightly creased where he'd folded and unfolded it once before setting it back down. Good morning. I made coffee. 8 words and an initial. He had read more threatening documents written by men who wanted him dead, contracts designed to quietly dismantle everything he owned. And none of them had occupied as much space in the back of his mind as those 8 words that bothered him more than the note itself. He was at the desk at 6:15 on a Tuesday when Choi Dae-won knocked and entered without waiting, which was the protocol they had established years ago. Knock once, enter, speak. Tae-hyun didn't look up from the financial report he was annotating. The Busan situation, Dae-won said. He was already in his coat, which meant this had come in overnight. Tae-hyun set down his pen. Talk. The new port contact. The one replacing Sergeant Wu. He's already made contact with the Shin network, twice in the last 10 days. The second meeting was in Incheon. Taehyun absorbed that. The Shin network was not a casual name to drop at 6 in the morning. They had been a peripheral irritant for years. A mid-tier operation based out of Incheon that had ambitions larger than their infrastructure supported. On their own, they were manageable. Connected to the Port Authority, they became a logistical problem with the potential to become a revenue problem with the potential to become something worse. Who made the introduction? Tae-hyun said. We don't know yet. Then find out before the week is over. Dae-won nodded. He started to turn toward the door, then stopped. There's one more thing. He held for a half second. It may be unrelated. Say it. Someone ran a background check on your wife. Professional grade. Not a journalist. The access level suggests someone with connections to financial intelligence. The inquiry came through a shell in Singapore 2 days ago. Tae-hyun was still. Not frozen. Still, the way a man goes still when the information arriving requires all available processing, and none of it can afford to leak into his face or his hands. Depth of the check, he said. Financial history. Business associates. Her family in Atlanta. Travel records for the last 4 years. Daewon kept his voice even, reporting facts, nothing more. Comprehensive. Taehyun picked his pen back up. Not to write, just to have something in his hand. Put Junseo on the Singapore shell. I want a name by Thursday. Yes. And Daewon. The man stopped at the door. She doesn't know about this. Not yet. Understood. He left. Taehyun sat in the quiet for a long moment, the pen turning slowly between his fingers, and looked at the note in the corner of his desk. Good morning. I made coffee. Someone was already looking at her. He'd been married 11 days. Imani had a client meeting at 9 in Sinchon and a fitting review at 2 in Hongdae, and somewhere between those two appointments she was supposed to be adjusting to the fact that she lived in a penthouse with a man who communicated in complete sentences but incomplete feelings. She wasn't complaining about the apartment. She would have been lying to herself if she'd pretended it wasn't extraordinary. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a studio space she'd claimed in the second week by moving a reading chair and a work table to the room with the best north light. The kind of kitchen that made her want to actually cook. She wasn't complaining about the arrangement either, not exactly. Taehyun had been correct. That was the word. He was correct. Courteous in a formal, careful way. Present at dinner 3 of the first 10 evenings, absent the other 7, and when present, he ate and asked questions about her work with the focused attention of someone who was either genuinely interested or extremely disciplined at appearing so. She was starting to suspect it was both. What she was not adjusting to, the thing that sat at the edge of every morning and didn't resolve, was the feeling of existing inside a structure she didn't fully understand. His world had architecture she could sense without seeing, the car that was always waiting, the calls he took in the other room with the door closed, always in a tone that had no volume but a particular quality of gravity. The men who moved through their lives, Daewon, Junseo, others she hadn't been introduced to, with the practiced invisibility of people who had learned to be necessary without being noticeable. She was not naive. She had agreed to this with her eyes open. That didn't mean the eyes had seen everything. She was in the back of the car on the way to Sinchon when her phone rang. Unknown number, Korean prefix. She answered because she was still conditioning herself to answer numbers she didn't recognize in a country where the number you needed rarely announced itself first. Ms. Brooks. The voice was older, male, with a precision to it that suggested the speaker had never said an imprecise thing in his life. Or I suppose I should say Mrs. Kong. She watched the Han River slide past the window. Who is this? A man who knew your husband's father long before your husband existed, and who has watched this family with considerable attention for many years. A pause, calibrated. You have recently married into a situation you may not fully understand. I would like to offer you some clarity. I'm not in the habit of taking calls from men who don't give their names. That instinct serves you well. It will serve you even better in the weeks ahead. Another pause. Ask your husband about a man named Lee Byung-chul. Ask him what happened in Busan in 2019. Watch his face when you ask. The line went dead. She sat with the phone in her lap and looked at the river until the bridge passed and it disappeared, and she breathed slowly and carefully and did not let her hands shake, because she had made a decision 3 weeks ago that she was still standing inside of, and unnamed phone calls were not going to change that before she understood what they meant. But she turned the name over in her mind. Lee Byung-chul, Busan, 2019. She filed it and said nothing. I was home before she was that evening, which surprised her. She found him in the kitchen of all places. Not cooking, nothing that domestic, but standing at the counter with a glass of scotch reading something on his phone. He looked up when she walked in. He was still in his work clothes, tie loosened by 2 inches, jacket gone. It was the most undone she had seen him look, and it was still precise by any ordinary standard. You're early, she said. Meeting canceled. He set the phone face down. How was the fitting review? She dropped her bag on the kitchen stool and reached for the refrigerator. Productive. The client wants to change the collar structure on 3 of the 5 pieces, which means reworking the shoulder seams, which she doesn't fully understand yet. She found the container of leftover rice she'd made the previous evening and turned toward the microwave. How was your day? Complicated. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was watching her in that way. The actual looking way, not the polite social glance people used when they asked questions they didn't really want answered. Just complicated or complicated, she said. The second one. She turned back to the microwave and said, I got a phone call today. And she said it the way she delivered most things, directly, without softening, without the particular brand of emotional scaffolding that most people built around difficult information. The silence behind her had a texture. She could feel him go still before she turned around. Who? He said. No name. Male. Older, I think. He said he'd known your father for a long time. She turned around and looked at him. He told me to ask you about Lee Byung-chul and about Busan in 2019. Something happened to Tae-hyun's face that she filed immediately and permanently. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't simple enough for guilt. It was the expression of a man who had built a specific wall around a specific room and had just heard someone knock on it from the inside, which meant the architecture he'd trusted had a crack he didn't know about. Where did you take the call? He said. In the car, on the way to Sinchon. Your personal phone. Yes. He set the scotch down. He looked at the counter for a moment. That micro-pause she was learning to recognize, the processing interval, the beat between receiving information and deciding what to do with it. And then he looked up at her with the version of his face that gave the least away, which meant whatever was underneath was significant. I'll have the number traced, he said. That's not what I asked. I know. Then tell me about Lee Byung-chul. He picked up the scotch again and took a slow sip, and she waited, because she was good at waiting. She had practiced it for years in rooms where being the person who spoke first was almost always the wrong move. He was a man I did business with in Busan, Tae-hyun said finally. Briefly. In 2019. And the business relationship ended badly. How badly? He looked at her. Badly enough that his family holds a particular position toward mine. She absorbed that. Is he someone who would send someone to look into my background? A professional level check. Financial records, travel history, family. Another stillness. This one was different from the processing kind. This one had an edge to it, the quality of a man recalibrating rapidly in a direction she couldn't fully read. Someone ran a check on you? He said. You didn't know? No. But you're not surprised. He didn't answer that, which was its own answer. She leaned back against the counter and looked at him with the full weight of her attention. When we did this, when I agreed to this arrangement, you told me there would be things in your world I wouldn't have access to. I accepted that. I'm not asking you to hand me everything. She kept her voice level. But I need to know if I'm being watched by someone who considers me relevant to a problem you haven't told me about. You're not in danger. That's also not what I asked. He set the glass down with slightly more force than usual. Not a slam, nothing that theatrical, just a fraction harder than deliberate. The first indication of pressure she'd seen from him, small and controlled and entirely real. The Lee family has been inactive for several years, he said. If someone connected to them is moving now, it's likely a response to the marriage. You as a variable, not as a target. A variable. In a calculation I'm still identifying. Right. She nodded slowly. So I'm a variable in a calculation connected to something that happened in Busan 6 years ago that ended badly, and someone thinks I'm relevant enough to investigate thoroughly, and you're still identifying the shape of the problem. She looked at him without heat, without accusation, just clearly. I need you to understand something, Tae-hyun. I can handle complexity. I can handle living inside a situation that has edges I can't see yet. What I cannot handle is being managed. I'm not managing you. You almost didn't tell me about the background check. A silence. You found out about it from someone else first, she continued, quieter now. And even after I told you about the call, you were choosing how much to confirm. I could watch it happening. She held his gaze. I'm not your enemy. I'm not naive, and I'm not fragile, and I'm not going anywhere. But you need to decide pretty quickly whether I'm a partner in this house or a variable in your calculations, because I won't be both. I was looking at her with that full, direct attention that she had cataloged in sketch after sketch without understanding what she was drawing. Up close, without the distance of a crowded room or the buffer of a white linen table, it was more than she had anticipated. The weight of it, the quality of being truly examined by a mind that spent most of its time examining threats. I don't know how to do that, he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her since the lunch in Gangnam. She could hear it, not as an excuse but as a fact, stated with the same flatness he used for everything, stripped of self-pity, just a man naming his own limitation with the precision he applied to everything else. She picked up her rice from the microwave. Then we'll figure it out. She looked at him over the container. After dinner. He almost laughed. She wasn't sure, but the exhale had something in it. Junseo came back with the Singapore trace on Wednesday evening, and the name attached to it wasn't Lee family connected at all. It was Kang Sung-woo, Tae-hyun's cousin, the one his father had used as leverage. Tae-hyun sat with that for 4 minutes alone in his car outside the building before he went upstairs. 4 minutes was longer than he usually gave anything. He sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the name on his phone screen and felt the specific cold clarity of a man who has understood something he wishes he hadn't. Sung-woo wasn't waiting for the inheritance to come to him. He was working to make it come faster, which meant the background check on Imani wasn't about the Lee family at all. It was reconnaissance. Someone was building a case, looking for leverage, looking for a weakness, looking for anything that could be used to destabilize the marriage, destabilize Tae-hyun's position, give the board a reason to look at the succession question before Hyun-jae was ready to hand it over. And the anonymous call to Imani's phone. He replayed it. She told him the voice was older, male. Sung-woo was 28. But Seung-woo had connections his father had spent years cultivating, older men who owed Seung-woo's branch of the family, things that didn't show up in organizational charts. A proxy. A voice with enough credibility to plant a seed. Lee Byung-chul, Busan, 2019 tone. Sung-woo knew about Busan. He'd been adjacent to the family's operations that year, not involved, not trusted enough, but present enough to have picked up fragments. And he was smart enough to understand that whatever Tae-hyun hadn't told his new wife was a wound Seung-woo could keep pressing until it opened. He went upstairs. Imani was in the studio room, standing at the work table under the north light with her back to the door, working on something in charcoal. He saw this through the open door before she heard him. The bend of her shoulders, the focused stillness of someone in the middle of creating, the same quality of presence she had when she was listening, but directed inward. He knocked on the door frame. She looked over her shoulder. Hey! The Singapore trace came back, he said. She set the charcoal down and turned around fully. Her right hand was dark with it, smudged to the wrist. She didn't look at it. Who? My cousin, Sung-woo. She took that in without visible surprise, which told him she'd been running her own calculations. The one your father mentioned, the alternative successor. Yes. So the call was him too. Most likely a proxy, someone older he used for credibility. She nodded slowly. He's trying to destabilize the marriage. Yes, by making me distrust you. By finding something I haven't told you, and making sure you found out from someone other than me. He said it without spin, without softening, because she had told him 2 nights ago that she could see when he was choosing what to confirm, and he was done testing how much she could see. Busan in 2019, I need to tell you about it before he does it differently. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pulled out the stool from the work table and sat on it, and folded her charcoal-stained hands in her lap, and said, Okay. He stayed in the doorway. He didn't move into the room. Lee Byung-chul ran a network in Busan. Freight primarily, with secondary operations I won't detail. We had an arrangement that covered port access and distribution infrastructure. In the fall of 2019, it became clear that he was moving money through channels I didn't authorize and skimming from operations we shared. I gave him 2 opportunities to correct it. Tae-hyun kept his voice flat, the voice he used in boardrooms and threat assessments. He didn't. What happened to him? A beat. I was removed from the business. Tae-hyun held her gaze. And then removed from the situation permanently. The room was quiet. Outside, Seoul carried on at 30 floors below, taxis and delivery bikes and 10 million people moving through there Tuesday. And in the north-lit studio room of a penthouse, a woman who had looked at a man from across crowded rooms for 3 years and sketched the loneliness in his face was sitting very still, holding the weight of what she'd just been told. You're telling me you had him killed, she said. I'm telling you he was removed. Tae-hyun, he held her gaze. Yes. The silence stretched. She didn't look away, didn't flinch, didn't reach for the particular brand of moral scaffolding that the word removed was clearly meant to provide. She just sat with it, and he stood in the doorway and let her, because this was the moment. He understood that with complete clarity, where the arrangement either held or didn't, where she either saw the full shape of what she'd walked into and stayed, or saw it and left. Her hands were still in her lap. The charcoal was drying on her right wrist. "Is Seong-woo going to use this against me specifically," she said, "or against you through me?" He blinked. Once. It was involuntary. The only crack in composure he allowed himself, because that was not the question he had anticipated. "Through you," he said. "You're the variable. If the marriage destabilizes, the board questions the succession. If the board questions the succession, then your father's leverage over you disappears, and Seong-woo positions himself as the stable alternative." She nodded once, businesslike. "Okay. Okay. I'm not leaving," she said, and she said it without drama, without the weight of announcement, the same way she'd said, "I'll go first and you can catch up," as a fact, stated simply, because it was simply true. "I walked into this with my eyes open. I knew the shape of the world you lived in." She looked at him with those direct brown eyes that had been watching him for 3 years without his knowledge. "But Seong-woo is going to come at us again. And next time it might not be a phone call." "No," Tae-hyun agreed. "It won't be." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached for the charcoal on the work table, looked at it, and set it down again. When she looked back up at him, there was something in her face he hadn't seen before, not fear exactly, and not the performance of fearlessness either. Something real and calibrated and completely committed. "Then we should probably figure out how to stop him," she said. He looked at her in the doorway of the studio room she'd made from a spare corner of his empty apartment, in the north light, with charcoal on her wrist and 3 years of sketches he didn't know existed in a drawer 3 feet behind her. "Yes," he said. "We should, and somewhere across Seoul, in a building." Tae-hyun had never set foot in, and Imani didn't know existed. Kang Seung-woo was on the phone with a man whose name appeared in no organizational chart, and he was saying, "It's not enough yet. We need something that actually breaks them." And the man on the other end of the line said, "I think I know where to look." 3 days after the conversation in the studio room, Tae-hyun put Daewon on Seung-woo full-time. Not surveillance. Daewon was too recognizable for ground-level work, had been in the organization too long, and moved with too much of Tae-hyun's signature gravity to blend into the background of his cousin's life. He put Daewon on coordination, 2 men from the outer network, faces Seung-woo had never cataloged, rotating shifts, reporting back through a clean channel that didn't touch the main organizational structure. The separation was deliberate. If Seung-woo had eyes inside the organization, and Tae-hyun had to operate on the assumption that he did, then the investigation needed to exist outside the usual lines. He told Imani this over breakfast on a Thursday. Not a briefing, not a formal sit-down. She was at the kitchen counter eating toast and going through fabric samples on her tablet, and he was standing at the coffee machine, and he just said it, the way she'd asked him to, like people. She looked up from the tablet. "You trust those 2 men completely?" "Enough." "That's not what I asked." He poured the coffee. "In this business, complete trust is a standard nobody meets, including me." He set the mug in front of her and kept the second for himself. "I trust them to follow instructions and report accurately. That's what I need them for." She considered that. "Okay." She went back to the fabric samples. "Seung-woo's going to notice eventually." "Probably." "And when he does, he'll accelerate whatever he's planning." "Yes. So we need to know what he's planning before he knows we're looking." "That's the idea." She picked up the coffee without looking at him. "You're not bad at this when you actually talk." He didn't answer, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted. Not loosened exactly, nothing that visible, just the faintest degree of adjustment, the change that happens to a body when it stops bracing against a threat. It's slowly accepting isn't coming from that direction. She noticed. She always noticed. The room Seung-woo used for his private meetings was on the 14th floor of a building in Yeouido that officially housed a mid-sized investment advisory firm. The firm was real. It filed taxes, had clients, produced returns, but the 14th floor had a conference room that didn't appear on the building directory, reached by a separate elevator that required a keycard registered to a shell entity in Busan. On a Friday afternoon, 11 days after Tae-hyun put the surveillance in place, one of his two outer network men reported that Seung-woo had entered that building at 2:15 with a man they photographed but couldn't immediately identify. The photograph came to Tae-hyun at 4:30. I was in his car. He opened the image, looked at it for 3 seconds, and felt the specific cold that came not from surprise but from confirmation. The cold of a man who had suspected something and now had to live inside the proof. The man in the photograph with Seung-woo was director Yoon Song-pil. Yoon Song-pil, who had sat on the KTH Holdings board for 9 years, who had been one of 3 board members Tae-hyun had personally brought in during the restructuring 4 years ago, believing him to be an independent voice aligned with long-term organizational stability, who had access to every major financial document, every succession protocol, every contingency structure Tae-hyun had spent the last 4 years quietly building. He called Daewon. Get me everything on when Yoon and Seung-woo first made contact, he said. Not recent. Go back 2 years. I want the first meeting. You think it goes back that far? I think it goes back further. He put the car in motion. And I think the board meeting next Thursday isn't going to go the way I planned it. He didn't come home until after midnight. Amani was still awake. He could see the light under the studio room door, the thin gold line of it in the dark hallway. He stood outside for a moment with his jacket over his arm and his tie undone, and the weight of the evening sitting in his chest like something calcifying. He knocked. Come in. She was at the work table with the charcoal again. He was beginning to understand that charcoal was what she used when she was thinking, the way other people paced or drank. She was working on something large this time, a full sheet, and she didn't turn around immediately when he entered. Long night, she said. Yes. Sit down. You're still standing like you're in a boardroom. He pulled the chair from the corner and sat. She finished the mark she was making before she turned to look at him, and he registered the assessment she made in that first second, reading his face the way she read everything, with the patient thoroughness of someone who never looked at surfaces and called them complete. Yoon is with Seung-woo, he said. She was still. The board member. Yes. How long? We don't know yet. At least a year, possibly more. She set the charcoal down. She turned fully toward him and leaned against the work table with her arms crossed, not defensively, thinking. The board meeting Thursday. He controls 3 votes directly and has influence over 2 more. If Seung-woo has been working him for a year, those votes are prepared. He said it with the flatness he used for damage assessments, for post-incident reviews, for the kind of information that required processing before it could be acted on. They're going to call a confidence review, on the grounds that the marriage is irregular, a foreign national brought in under accelerated circumstances, no formal announcement through proper channels, the speed of it, the opacity. They're going to use me as the justification. Yes, she absorbed that without movement, without the sharp exhale he might have expected. She just held it, the way she held most hard things, straight on, without flinching, without needing to immediately route it somewhere. He had noticed this about her over the past weeks. She had a capacity for receiving bad news that most people he knew, men trained specifically for pressure, didn't have. Not numbness. Something different. A kind of deliberate rootedness, like a tree that had decided a long time ago that wind was not a good reason to stop being a tree. What does a confidence review mean in practical terms? She said. The board can recommend restructuring of executive authority. In theory, it requires my father's sign-off to execute. In practice, if they have the votes, they can freeze operational access pending review and force a family council that my father cannot easily override without open conflict. And your father? He looked at his hands. I don't know yet where my father stands. You don't know, or you don't want to consider it. He looked up. She held his gaze, not unkind. Those are different problems, she said. I went to see his father the next morning without calling ahead. The housekeeper let him in with the particular expressionlessness of staff who had worked in the Kong household long enough to understand that unannounced visits had a different texture than scheduled ones and required a different brand of invisibility. His father was in the back garden, standing at the low wall that overlooked the slope of the hillside, with a cup of tea. He heard Tae-hyun coming. He didn't turn. You know about Yoon, Tae-hyun said. Not a question. His father lifted the teacup. I know many things. Did you know when you restructured the board? Or after? A long pause. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of sole autumn day that made the city look cleaned. Below the wall, trees had started to turn. After, his father said, 2 months ago. 2 months. Tae-hyun stood with that. 2 months his father had held information about a board member in quiet contact with the one person who stood to benefit from Tae-hyun's removal, and had said nothing. Had in fact during those 2 months continued the marriage arrangement, continued the timeline, continued the performance of a man acting in his son's interest. Why didn't you tell me? Tae-hyun said. His father turned then. The morning light was not kind to 67. It found every year of what those years had required, every decision that couldn't be undone. But his eyes were the same, clear and measuring and entirely without apology. Because I needed to know what you would do, he said. Whether you would find it yourself, whether you had built the kind of operation that could see something like this before it arrived. He said it simply, without cruelty, with the devastating matter-of-factness of a man who had spent 40 years treating every relationship in his life, including his son, as a variable to be tested. You did find it. Tae-hyun looked at him. Something moved in his chest, old and complicated and entirely without resolution, the way feelings were when they'd been present since childhood, and had never found a landing place. I have a wife now because of an ultimatum you made while you were watching my board get compromised, he said. Yes. You handed me a marriage and a crisis at the same time. The marriage is not the crisis. The marriage is what gives you standing to fight the crisis. His father's voice was even, precise. An unmarried heir facing a confidence review is a man in a room alone. A married man, a man with a partner who is publicly known, publicly present, who has changed his behavior in ways the board and the city have already begun to notice, is a different argument. You used her. I gave you a resource. What you've done with it is your own. She's not a resource. His father looked at him. A long look, quiet and assessing, and something shifted in it. Something Tae-hyun hadn't seen before, or hadn't let himself see. A fractional softening in the set of his father's jaw that was as close as Hyun-jae ever came to surprise. No, his father said quietly. I can see that she isn't. Not anymore. Tae-hyun turned and left without another word. The crisis arrived faster than Thursday. It arrived on Tuesday evening at 7:43 in the form of a link sent to Tae-hyun's personal phone from a number he didn't recognize. The link led to a document hosted on a private server, a file that had been formatted with the deliberate neutrality of a legal brief, 17 pages of financial records, internal communications, and annotated transaction histories, all of it pertaining to the Busan operation. 2019, all of it, meticulously assembled, pointing to a single conclusion, that the removal of Lee Byung-chul had not been a private organizational matter, that it had involved funds moved through 2 KTH Holdings subsidiaries, that the paper trail, carefully reconstructed, created a direct line between a legitimate publicly listed company and the permanent resolution of a business dispute. Someone had built the case. Someone had spent months or years assembling the fragments into something that could survive scrutiny, not in a criminal court necessarily, but in a boardroom, in the press, in the specific ecosystem of reputation and leverage where Tae-hyun actually operated. His hands were steady when he closed the document. He was sitting in the kitchen. Imani was somewhere in the apartment. He could hear the faint movement of her, the soft sound of the studio room door. He sat with the phone on the table and the document closed in the full dimension of what had just arrived. This was not Seung-woo working alone. Seung-woo was 28 and hungry, but not meticulous, not patient enough for 17 pages of forensic financial reconstruction. This had the signature of someone older, someone who had been holding this for a long time and waiting for the right moment to use it. The man from the anonymous call. The proxy voice. I think I know where to look, the voice had said to Seung-woo. He'd looked. Tae-hyun stood up from the kitchen and walked to the studio room and opened the door. She was at the table. She looked up immediately. She read his face in the first half-second the way she always did, the comprehensive instant assessment, and he saw her go still. What happened? She said. He set the phone on the table in front of her. Read the document. She read it. He stood against the wall and watched her read it, watched the specific progression of her expression, not performing reactions, just having them, the small shifts of comprehension and calculation moving across her face as she moved through the pages. When she finished, she set the phone down and looked at the work table for a moment before she looked up. "They're going to distribute this," she said. "Yes. Or threaten to. The threat may be the point, leverage for the confidence review, something to hold over the process to guarantee the outcome they want. Or they release it outright and the board confidence review becomes the least of your problems." "Yes." She stood up slowly. "How many people have access to this document right now?" "Unknown. The server it's hosted on could have distributed copies on a timer. It could be in the hands of 3 journalists already. I don't know." He said it with the flatness he used for facts that were simply facts, however bad. "I have to assume the worst case." She came around the work table and stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the charcoal dust on her collar from earlier in the evening, the slight tension in her jaw that she held when she was thinking hard. "Is it accurate?" she said. "The document." He held her gaze. "The transactions are real. The reconstruction of what they connected to is accurate." "Okay." She nodded once. "Then we're not fighting the document, we're fighting the timing and the distribution." "Imani, don't tell me to step back from this." Her voice was quiet and direct. "You told me 2 nights ago that I wasn't a variable in your calculations. I'm going to need you to mean that right now." He looked at her. The studio room light was warm and low, and the city moved 30 floors below them, and everything he had built over 14 years was sitting on the edge of a 17-page document on a private server, and the woman standing in front of him. The woman he had agreed to marry because his father left him no choice. The woman who had left coffee on his counter and notes under his door and looked at him like he was worth looking at, was asking him to decide right now whether he was going to protect her from the shape of his own life or let her stand inside it. He had never let anyone inside it. Not completely. Not the actual room, the one with no performance and no architecture and no version of himself built for other people's consumption. "The document goes to certain journalists by Thursday morning if we don't move," he said. "That means we have 36 hours to intercept the distribution, neutralize Yoon before the board meeting, and find the proxy, the man who built this file, before he decides the threat is worth less than the publication." 36 hours. Yes. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she stepped back, picked up the phone from the table, and read the document a second time. Slower now, methodically, the way she examined fabric structures and design systems, looking for the seam. "Page 9, she said without looking up. "The second transaction, the account number in the footer." She held the phone toward him. "That format. That's not a Korean account structure." He looked at it. She was right. He had read it as a transit account, glossed over the format in the context of the broader document. But she was right. The structure was different. A digit sequence that didn't fit the standard routing architecture of any Korean financial institution he recognized. "Singapore," he said, "or somewhere using Singapore-adjacent formatting." She set the phone down, which means whoever built this file had access to a transaction that moved through an offshore account, which means they didn't just reconstruct this from Korean records. They had a source with offshore access. He stared at the number. "Sungwoo's Singapore shell," he said slowly, "the one that ran the background check on you. Same infrastructure." She met his eyes. Whoever the proxy is, whoever built this, they're connected to Seungwoo's offshore network, which means if you find the shell company's owner, you find the man who made the call. He looked at her. 36 hours and a thread. It was not a good position. It was not close to a good position. But it was the only one available, and she had found it in 4 minutes from a standing start in a studio room at 8 o'clock at night, and something shifted in his chest. Something that had been slowly shifting for weeks. The architecture of a wall built across a long, difficult childhood, moving by degrees in a direction he had never permitted it to move. He picked up his phone and called Daewon. "Get Junseo, my place in 20 minutes. He looked at Imani across the room. "And bring everything we have on the Singapore network." He ended the call. She was already moving toward the door. Heading for the kitchen, he realized, the practical reflex of a woman who understood that a long night was beginning and people needed to be functional to work. "Imani," he said. She stopped and looked back. "The sketches," he said, "in the drawer behind the work table." He held her gaze. "I found them last week. I wasn't going to say anything yet." A pause. "I wanted you to know that I saw them," he said. "All of them." She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame, and looked at him across the studio room, and something passed between them in that moment. Not a declaration, nothing that performed itself, just a recognition. Two people on either side of a distance that had been closing by degrees and was now close enough to feel. She didn't say anything. She nodded once, small and real, and turned and went to put the kettle on.
Bye.
Daewon and Junseo arrived in 18 minutes. The four of them sat at the kitchen table with coffee and laptops and the 17-page document open on two screens, and they worked. Imani was there from the start, not hovering, not performing usefulness, just present and functional, and neither Daewon nor Junseo questioned it, because Taehyun had sat her down at the table, and that was all the authorization that existed in this room. Junseo found the Singapore Shell's ownership trail at 11:40. It was buried under 3 layers of nominee directors and a Cayman intermediary, but he was methodical, and the thread Imani had pulled on page 9 turned out to be a real thread. It moved, it connected, it led somewhere. The name at the end of it was O.J. Myung, 61 years old. Former deputy director of a financial regulatory body, retired 8 years ago under circumstances that had never been fully explained publicly. He had known Kang Hyun-jae for 30 years. He had been present, in an advisory capacity, during the original expansion of the Kang Empire in the early 2000s. And in 2019, when Lee Byung-chul had been removed, O.J. Myung had been the man who processed the offshore transactions. He had built the file because he had assembled the pieces himself, in real time, and kept them. He's been waiting, Taehyun said. For the right moment, Imani said, for the right partner. He looked at the name on the screen. Sung-woo approached him, or he approached Seung-woo. Either way, they found each other because they both wanted the same outcome. Where is he now? Daewon said. Junseo was already typing. Property records show a residence in Hanam-dong. He also maintains a secondary address, an apartment registered to one of the nominee entities. Start with Hanam-dong, Taehyun said. He looked at his watch. 11:58. We have 30 hours. They didn't sleep. Imani dozed for 90 minutes on the couch around 3 in the morning, which Taehyun registered without comment. Registering it, the fact of her there, the particular shape of her asleep with her arm across her face and her collar still dusted with charcoal, while he sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and the full architecture of the next 30 hours laid out in his mind like a building that needed to be constructed and demolished simultaneously. At 5, Daewon confirmed that O.J. Myung was in the Hanam-dong residence. At 6, Taehyun woke Imani by setting a fresh cup of coffee on the table next to her. She surfaced quickly, not groggy, immediately present, the way she did everything. What time is it? 6. What do we have? Enough. He sat down across from her. O.J. Myung is in Hanam-dong. I'm going to see him this morning. He held her gaze. Alone. She looked at him. Define alone. D1 outside, no one else. And what are you going to say to him? I'm going to give him a choice. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. He could see her working through it, the angles, the risks, the thing he wasn't saying directly, but that she was experienced enough in the shape of his world to hear underneath what he did say. You're going to offer him something, she said, or you're going to threaten him with something. Which one? Both, he said, in that order. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, come back. And she said it plainly, without decoration, not as a plea, as a requirement. I will. The Hanam-dong residence was a 4-story townhouse on a quiet street above the river. Old money neighborhood, the kind of street where the houses were set back from the road, and the trees were tall enough to have been planted by someone's grandfather. Daewon parked at the corner and Taehyun walked to the front door alone. He rang the bell at 7:12 in the morning. O.J. Myung answered in a robe and slippers, which meant the man either hadn't been warned or had decided warning was unnecessary. He was exactly as the records described, 61, compact, with the particular stillness of men who had spent careers inside the machinery of power without being its public face. He looked at Taehyun for 1 second before his expression closed completely. You'd better come in, he said. The house was ordered and quiet. A housekeeper appeared from somewhere and was dismissed with a gesture. O.J. Myung led him to a sitting room at the back of the first floor that looked out over a small walled garden, and he sat in the chair closest to the window and did not offer Taehyun a seat. Taehyun stood. He was fine with standing. You built a thorough file, Taehyun said. I kept accurate records. No apology, no performance. The voice of a man who had conducted difficult conversations for decades. That's a habit, not a weapon. It became a weapon when you gave it to my cousin. Oh Jae-myung looked at him with the eyes of someone who had decided this conversation's outcome already. Your cousin asked for something that could create a credible argument at the board level. I had something relevant. You had something that connects you directly to the 2019 transactions. You understand that. The connection is technical. A processor follows instructions. A processor who kept copies for 6 years and handed them to a man trying to remove me from my own organization is not a neutral technician. Taehyun's voice was even and cold and entirely without heat. You knew what you were giving him. You knew what it would be used for. And you did it because... He paused, one beat. I want to understand why, before we discuss what happens next. Something moved in the old man's face. Not guilt. Something more complicated. An old grievance, the particular flavor of resentment that had been maintained carefully over years. Your father promised me a seat at the table when he restructured in 2008, he said. I processed transactions for 15 years that nobody was supposed to know about. Kept his books clean in ways that required expertise and silence and complete discretion. His hands were folded in his lap, entirely still. When the restructuring came, he gave the board seats to men younger than me who had done a fraction of what I had. He thanked me, sent a case of wine. He looked at Taehyun directly. I have been patient. I have waited for the right arrangement. Your cousin found me, or you found him. A slight pause. Does it matter? Taehyun looked at him for a long moment. The garden beyond the window was full of morning light, cold and clean, the kind of autumn light that made everything look clearer than it was. I'm going to offer you something, Taehyun said, and then I'm going to tell you what happens if you decline. I expected nothing less. The document doesn't reach the journalist. The distribution is canceled. The copies held in the offshore network are deleted in my presence, or the presence of someone I designate. He kept his voice flat. In exchange, I will bring a proposal to the board within 60 days for an advisory consultation structure. Formal. Compensated. With your name attached to it in a capacity that reflects what you actually contributed to this organization over 15 years. He let that sit for a moment. My father made you a promise he didn't keep. I'll keep a version of it, a real one. Oh Jae-myung looked at him. And if I decline, then I spend the next 72 hours dismantling every financial structure you have used in the last 6 years, starting with the Singapore entity. I will find every transaction that connects you to your nominee network, and I will present those findings to the regulatory authority where you spent 20 years of your career. Taehyun kept his eyes on the man's face. You kept clean records because precision is your habit. That works both ways. The silence in the sitting room was total. Outside, a bird moved through the garden. The morning light shifted by a degree. Oh Jae-myung looked at his folded hands. He looked at them for a long time, with the expression of a man doing a final calculation, the one that determines whether pride or survival wins. The copies can be deleted by end of day, he said. I'll want the advisory proposal in writing within 10 days. 15, Taehyun said, and we do the deletion now. Yet, I was back at the penthouse by 9:30. Imani was on the phone when he walked in. Professional voice, client call, the focused cadence she used with difficult accounts. She looked up when he entered, read his face in the first second, and held up one finger. He went to the kitchen and poured water and waited. She ended the call 4 minutes later. It's done, he said when she appeared in the doorway. Oh Jae-myung, he'll pull the distribution. The copies are being deleted under Daewon's oversight as of 30 minutes ago. She exhaled, controlled but real. And Seungwoo. Seungwoo loses his leverage and his board ally in the same morning. Taehyun set the glass down. What he does next depends on whether he's smart enough to understand that the position he was building doesn't exist anymore. Is he smart enough? No, Taehyun said simply. Which means he'll try something else. Something faster and less careful. When? Before Thursday's board meeting. He has 2 days. She nodded. She was standing in the kitchen doorway in yesterday's clothes with dark circles under her eyes, and charcoal still on her left wrist that she'd missed when she washed her hands, and she was thinking with the same full attention she brought to everything, the same directness, the same refusal to be overwhelmed by the complexity of what she was standing inside. He looked at her and felt something in his chest that he had been refusing to name for 3 weeks because naming it required admitting that the wall was down, and he wasn't certain he knew how to exist without it. "I told you last night," he said, "about the sketches." She met his eyes. "You did? I've been trying to figure out what to say about them." "You don't have to say anything. I know. I'm choosing to." He held her gaze. "You've been watching me for 3 years without my knowing. You saw something in me worth drawing, worth looking at repeatedly, when there was no reason to." He said it plainly, without the performance of vulnerability that other men might have used to make it palatable. "Just a fact," stated directly. "I don't know what to do with that. I've never known what to do with being seen." She looked at him across the kitchen and didn't reach for an easy answer. She said, "You're doing fine." And she said it with a slight curve at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, which was exactly the version of tenderness she deployed, the kind that didn't ask anything back. He almost said something further. He didn't, because his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Seung-woo. He answered it on the second ring. "Cousin, we should meet." Seung-woo's voice was tight, the specific tension of a man who had received bad news and was rerouting at speed. "Today. Not at the office. Somewhere neutral." "Why?" "Because I think we've both been played by the same person, and we need to talk about it before Thursday makes everything worse." Tae-hyun was still. He looked at Imani across the kitchen. She was watching him with complete attention, reading what she could from one side of the call. "Say that again," Tae-hyun said. "Oh, Jae-myung wasn't working for me," Seung-woo said. "I thought he was. I gave him access to the Singapore network because he told me he had leverage over you that I could use. He was the one who came to me 8 months ago, out of nowhere, with the outline of what he had." A pause, and in it Tae-hyun heard something he hadn't expected. Genuine fear. "He played us both. He used my network, my name, my money. The board play was his design. I was the vehicle, not the architect." "And Yoon approached me 6 weeks ago saying O had connected them. I thought I was building a coalition. I was being used as a front." His voice cracked slightly, 28 and frightened, underneath everything. "He's been planning something bigger than removing you from the board, Hyun. I don't know what. But this morning 2 men I've never seen before showed up at my apartment asking questions about the offshore network, and I don't think they were yours." Tae-hyun's hand was steady on the phone. His heart was not. "Where are you now?" he said. "My car. Moving." "Keep moving. Don't go home. Call me back in 20 minutes from a different number." He ended the call and stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand and the full shape of what had just shifted landing in his chest with the weight of something dropped from a height. Oh, Jae-myung had agreed too quickly. The folded hands. The calculation. The slight pause before he said the copies can be deleted by end of day. Not a man surrendering, Tae-hyun realized now, cold and clear. A man buying time. A man whose actual objective was not the board meeting at all. "What is it?" Imani said. He looked at her. "Seung-woo was a distraction," he said. "The board play, the document, the Singapore network, all of it was designed to pull my attention onto my cousin, while Oh Jae-myung used the access Seung-woo gave him to build something else." "What's something else?" "I don't know yet." He was already moving toward the hallway. But there were 2 men at Seung-woo's apartment this morning that he didn't recognize. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at her. "Stay here. Don't open the door to anyone until Daewon." His phone buzzed. A message from Daewon. "Deletion was a stall. The server in Singapore pushed a copy to a second location before we arrived. New host is domestic, Seoul-based. And there's something else. Oh, Jae-myung left the house 10 minutes after you did. He met someone. I'm sending you the photo now." The photo loaded. Tae-hyun looked at it, and for the first time in 14 years of building an empire on the certainty that he understood the shape of the threats around him, the ground moved under his feet. The man in the photo with Oh Jae-myung was not a criminal, was not a rival, was not anyone from any network tie Hyun had ever mapped or accounted for. He was standing on a public street in Hanam-dong at 9:45 in the morning and shaking hands with Kang Hyun-jae, Tae-hyun's father. The phone felt heavy in his hand. The kitchen was very quiet. Imani was looking at him from across the room with her full attention, reading his face, and whatever she read there made her take one step toward him. Tae-hyun, she said. He looked up from the photo and met her eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, the wall was so completely down that she could see everything. The 14 years. The cold house. The father who had tested him instead of warned him. The marriage arranged while a board was being compromised. The ultimatum and the crisis and the resource and the variable and the entire architecture of a life built by a man who had decided long ago that love was a liability and had raised his son accordingly. It was my father, he said. He said it the way he said everything. Flat, precise, stripped of performance. And it was the most devastating sentence he had spoken in 32 years. He stood in the kitchen doorway for 11 seconds. Imani counted them without meaning to. The particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow that couldn't be absorbed quickly, couldn't be routed into action or strategy, or the clean machinery of response that he used for everything else. This one had to be felt first. She understood that. She stood across the kitchen and didn't move toward him and didn't speak, because some blows required the space to land fully before anyone reached for them. On the 12th second, he put the phone in his pocket. I need to go to my father's house, he said. I know. I need you to stay here. No. He looked at her. Not with argument, just looked, the full direct assessment, reading what was in her face. If your father engineered this whole thing, she said, keeping her voice level, then this isn't a conversation you should walk into alone. You'll be inside his house, on his ground, with a man who has spent 30 years being smarter than everyone in the room, and you are not, right now, in this moment, at your best. She held his gaze. I'm not asking to sit at the table. I'm asking to be in the car. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Get your coat, he said. Daewon drove. Imani sat in the back with Tae-hyun, and neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes. Seoul moved past the windows, the city going about its Tuesday, with complete indifference to the specific wreckage happening in the back seat of a black car on the expressway north toward Seongbuk-dong. At the 11-minute mark, Tae-hyun said, he called it a resource. She turned to look at him. When I told him you weren't a resource, he was looking out the window. He said he'd given me a resource and what I did with it was my own. I told him you weren't that. And he said, he stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. He said he could see that she isn't, not anymore. He turned from the window and looked at her with something raw in his face that he wasn't trying to manage. He knew. He was watching it happen. He arranged a marriage, watched you fall into it, and simultaneously ran an operation through Oh Jae-myung and your cousin's network that was designed to... She stopped. What was it designed to do? It can't just be a test. The document is real. The risk to you was real. The risk to me was the point, Tae-hyun said, and she heard it in his voice, not anger, something older, the specific exhaustion of a man who has spent a lifetime being evaluated instead of loved. He doesn't believe in gifts. He doesn't believe in giving someone something they haven't been forced to fight for. He arranged the marriage because he wanted the succession secured. He arranged the crisis because he wanted to know if I could survive it. And he arranged it all simultaneously because... He stopped again. Because he wanted to see if I would let you in, if I was capable of it. The car was quiet. He tested you, she said carefully, by putting both of us in real danger. Yes. And the Oh Jae-myung meeting this morning, the handshake on the street, was deliberate. He knew Daewon would photograph it. He knew it would come to me. Tae-hyun's voice was entirely flat now, the flatness of deep water, nothing shallow about it. He wanted me to know it was him, not after, now, before I walked into that house. She looked at her hands in her lap. He's telling you he's not hiding. He's telling me to come ready, Tae-hyun said. He's done testing from a distance. He wants the conversation. The housekeeper opened the front door before they reached it. His father was in the main room this time, not the garden, standing at the center of it, in a dark suit, as if he had dressed specifically for this, which he had. Everything Hyun-jae did was specific. He looked at Tae-hyun when he entered, then he looked at Imani beside him, and something moved in the old man's eyes. Not surprise, not displeasure. Something that might, on a different face, have been called satisfaction. You brought her, he said. She's my wife, Tae-hyun said. Apparently you've forgotten that's a real thing. I haven't forgotten anything. His father moved to the chair near the window and sat, unhurried, the motion of a man who had decided the shape of this conversation in advance and was not concerned about the outcome. Sit down, both of you. Imani sat. Taehyun did not. Oh Jae-myung, Taehyun said. Yes. You've been running him for how long? Since he came to me. 8 months ago. His father folded his hands in his lap, and the gesture was so similar to Oh Jae-myung's that morning, the stillness, the deliberate composure, that Imani felt the chill of it, the inheritance of a certain kind of coldness passing through generations, like a recessive gene that didn't skip. He came to me with his grievance. He had built a file. He wanted recognition, compensation, the seat he believed I'd promised him. He looked at Taehyun with clear and steady eyes. I told him I would help him get it, by using him against me, by giving him a purpose that served both of us. That's not an answer. It's the only answer there is. His father's voice didn't change. Calm, dispassionate, the voice of a man explaining the mechanics of weather. Sung-woo was becoming a problem I needed addressed without my involvement on the record. Oh Jae-myung wanted a platform. You needed a crisis that would force you to operate at the full extent of your capability under genuine threat. He paused. I provided all three things simultaneously. The room was very quiet. Taehyun stood in the center of it with his hands at his sides and looked at his father across 20 years of boardrooms and cold dinners and portrait-lined hallways, and a mother who had died in a room on the second floor, while two men who both claimed to love her had been in separate buildings not thinking about her. Sung-woo is scared, Taehyun said. 2 men came to his apartment this morning. Mine. To collect the documentation he'd accumulated. It's been returned. You're cleaning up the operation. It's concluded. Because I found Oh Jae-myung. Because you found Oh Jae-myung, identified the Singapore thread, negotiated a resolution, and this morning you came to this house with your wife beside you instead of alone. His father looked at him with those clear, measuring eyes. Yes, it's concluded. The specific fury that moved through Taehyun in that moment was not hot. It was cold, pressurized, the kind of anger that had been formed under years of compression and had no interest in the performance of rage. He walked toward his father's chair and stopped 6 feet from it and looked down at the man who had built an empire and raised a son with the same methodology, as a project, as a system, as a thing to be optimized rather than known. I almost lost the board, Taehyun said. The document could have reached journalists. The entire Busan operation was never going to reach journalists. Oh Jae-myung is not suicidal. The threat was real enough to create pressure, not real enough to be executed. His father met his gaze without flinching. I calculated the risk precisely. You calculated it. Taehyun's voice dropped to almost nothing. You calculated the risk to my organization, to my marriage, to her. He didn't gesture toward Imani. He didn't need to. She got a phone call on her way to a client meeting with a dead man's name in it. She spent 2 days inside a crisis she walked into because of an arrangement you forced. You calculated that as an acceptable risk. His father was quiet for a moment. A real moment. Not the processing interval, not the tactical pause, something that sat differently. Yes, he said. I did. And if you'd miscalculated, then I would have managed the consequences. He held Taehyun's gaze. I do not expect you to forgive the method. I'm telling you the intention. The intention, Taehyun repeated. The intention was to give you everything. His father said it quietly, and for the first time in 32 years the voice was different. Not the boardroom voice, not the patriarch voice. Something underneath both of those that was smaller and more honest and considerably more damaged. An organization that could survive because you had fought for it under real conditions, not inherited it in comfortable succession. A marriage that meant something because you had protected it instead of endured it. And the knowledge, he stopped. His jaw was tight. The knowledge that you are capable of more than I was, that you let someone in, that you did not do to your marriage what I did to mine. The room held that. Imani sat very still on the edge of her chair with her hands in her lap and listened to an old man say the most honest thing he had probably ever said to his son, wrapped in the most ruthless delivery possible, and thought about the specific tragedy of people who learned love as a theory and spent their lives practicing it as strategy. You could have told me, Taehyun said. His voice was different now too, quieter, something stripped in it. You wouldn't have fought the same way if you'd known it was constructed. You don't know that. I know you, his father said, better than you have ever been comfortable with. A long silence. Taehyun turned away from his father's chair and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. The same posture he'd had at the start of everything, in the boardroom on the 47th floor, looking out at a city he controlled and felt nothing inside of. Except that now it was different. The posture was the same. The man inside it was not. Imani stood up. She walked to Taehyun at the window and stood beside him, not in front of him, not reaching for him, just beside him, shoulder parallel to shoulder, looking out at the same hillside and the same cold autumn light. She didn't say anything. After a moment, his hand found hers. Not a dramatic gesture, just his hand moving to her hand, their fingers settling against each other with the quiet certainty of two people who had been in the same storm and were standing on the same ground. Behind them, Kang Hyun-jae looked at his son's back and his son's wife standing at the window of the house, where he had spent 40 years being powerful and lonely. And he sat with his folded hands and said nothing, because there was nothing left that needed saying. The board meeting happened on Thursday as scheduled. Taehyun walked in at 9 o'clock with Junseo and Daewon, and a folder that contained, among other things, Oh-jae Myung's signed withdrawal of every document he had compiled, the dissolution of the Singapore shell entity under Seung-woo's name, and a notarized statement from Yoon Song-pil, who had received a visit from Daewon on Wednesday evening, confirming that he had been approached with misleading information and was withdrawing his request for a confidence review. It took 40 minutes. Seung-woo was not in the room. He had sent a written communication the previous evening that he would be traveling for an indefinite period and wished to step back from active family business involvement. Taehyun had read the communication, understood it for what it was, a frightened 28-year-old finding the exit before the exit found him, and had told Junseo to file it without response. When the board meeting concluded and the room cleared, Taehyun sat alone at the conference table for a few minutes. Not strategizing, not running numbers, just sitting in the room where things were decided, on the 47th floor above the city he had built, and nearly lost and rebuilt in the space of 36 hours, and breathing slowly and letting the silence be what it was. His phone had a message from Imani. A photo. Her work table, taken from above. The large charcoal piece she'd been working on the night, everything had accelerated. She'd finished it. It was him. Not the distant profile from the gala 3 years ago, not the composed executive in the dark suit. It was him as she had seen him in the studio room doorway at 8 in the evening, in yesterday's clothes with his tie undone and the weight of everything visible in his face, the wall down, the room behind him empty, his hand on the door frame as if he needed something to hold. He looked at it for a long time. Then he typed, "I'll be home by 6. Her response came in under a minute. "I'm making dinner. Don't be late." He put the phone in his pocket and gathered his things and left. They ate at the kitchen table, which had become, in the space of 3 weeks, one of the small anchors of the life they were building inside the apartment that used to feel like a model home for a person who didn't actually live there. She'd made jollof rice, the real version, the Atlanta version, the one with the tomato base that had to be watched and stirred and which filled the whole apartment with the smell of something warm and inhabited. He had eaten it with more attention than he gave most things, which she understood was the highest form of compliment available from a man who communicated in precision rather than performance. "Your father called me this afternoon," she said, when the plates were mostly cleared. He looked up. He asked if he could visit sometime, not an official visit. She kept her voice neutral, giving him the information without loading it. "He said he wanted to see what the apartment looked like with someone actually living in it." Taehyun was still for a moment. Then he looked down at the table. "What did you say?" "I said I'd ask you." She looked at him. "It's your call." I was quiet for a long time. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned, over 3 weeks, that his silences were not empty. They were where he kept the things he was still figuring out how to say. "He's not going to change," Taehyun said finally. "He's going to be exactly what he's always been, calculating, certain he's right, incapable of a straightforward expression of anything. Probably. And I'm going to spend the next 20 years being furious at him at least half the time. That seems realistic." He looked up. "But he's the only father I have, and he said something in that room that I think he's been holding for a long time." He held her gaze. "I'm not ready to forgive the method. I don't know if I ever will be completely, but I don't want to close the door." She nodded. "I'll tell him he can come for dinner. 2 weeks. when things have settled. Don't make anything elaborate. I'll make exactly what I want to make, and he can eat it or not." He almost smiled. The real version. It had been arriving more frequently, small and unguarded, a reflex he hadn't fully trained out of himself yet, and was, she suspected, slowly stopping trying to. "He'll eat it," he said. "He has better manners than me." "That's a low bar." "I know." She stood and started clearing plates, and he stood to help her, which he had started doing sometime in the second week without announcement or precedent, just appearing at her elbow at the sink with a dish towel the way people did in kitchens where they actually lived. And she had not commented on it, because commenting on it would have made it a thing, and it was better as a fact. They washed up in companionable quiet, and she thought about the distance between where they had started. 4 feet of white linen and crystal glassware, and 2 people performing the mathematics of a transaction. And where they were now, standing at a sink in an apartment that smelled like dinner, with charcoal on the work table in the studio, and a note that had been left in a corner of a desk for 3 weeks. "The sketches," she said. She handed him a plate to dry. "Now that we've addressed roughly everything else." He dried the plate. "What about them?" "You said you'd been trying to figure out what to say." "I have been." "It's been about 16 hours since you said that. I thought you might have gotten there." He set the plate in the cabinet and took the next one from her hand and was quiet for a moment. She let him be quiet. "The one in the doorway," he said. "The one you finished last night." "Yes. That's how you see me." It wasn't quite a question. She looked at him sideways. "That's what I saw in that moment, when you were standing in the doorway and the wall was down." She handed him the last plate. "I've been drawing you for 3 years because there was something in your face that I recognized. That particular look people have when they've decided to not need anything from anyone. And it's worked, and they're very good at it, and it has cost them everything." She looked back at the water draining from the sink. "I recognized it because I know what it looks like from the outside. I've worn it too." He dried the plate and set it in the cabinet and folded the dish towel over the handle of the oven, and he stood with his hands braced on the counter and looked at the window above the sink where the city lights had started to come on in the early dark of autumn. 3 years ago," he said, "at a gala. You were near the edge of the room." She went still. "Dark green." He kept his eyes on the window. "Not last week's dress. Something else. You were holding a glass of something you weren't drinking." She turned to look at him fully. "You saw me. For about 30 seconds. He didn't move from the counter. "You were looking at me from across the room in a way that—" He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. "Nobody looks at me like that. Like I'm something that needs understanding rather than management." He turned to look at her. "I forgot about it. I told myself I forgot about it." A pause. "I didn't completely." She looked at him in the kitchen of the apartment where she had brought her work table and her charcoal and her leftover rice and her direct brown eyes and her habit of leaving notes under doors. And she thought about 3 years of sketches in a drawer and 36 hours of crisis and a father who had loved his son the only way he knew how, which was badly and completely, and the particular shape of 2 people finding each other in the middle of a transaction and discovering something neither of them had budgeted for. "Tae-hyun," she said. "I know," he said. He said it quietly, without the flatness, without the architecture, just his voice underneath everything. "I know what it is. I'm not going to pretend I don't." She held his gaze. "Okay. I don't know how to do it right. I know. I'm going to do it badly sometimes. I know that too. And you're still—" "Yes," she said before he could finish. "I'm still." He looked at her for a long moment in the light of the kitchen that was theirs, in the apartment that was finally a home, in the city that had held them both in separate orbits for 3 years, and had brought them together through an ultimatum and a crisis, and a father who understood love as a proof of concept rather than a gift. And then he crossed the kitchen and he put his arms around her and held on, and she felt the full weight of him, the real weight, not the composed boardroom presence or the cold performance of untouchability, but the actual human weight of a 32-year-old man who had been carrying himself alone for a very long time. She held on back. Outside, Seoul lit itself up the way it did every evening, indifferent and magnificent, 10 million lives in the dark. And in the kitchen of a penthouse on the 32nd floor, 2 people stood holding each other in the particular silence that comes after the storm has passed, and what remains is only what was real. Months later, there was a dinner. The table had 8 people: Tae-hyun and Imani, Kang Hyun-jae, who arrived exactly on time and complimented the meal without being asked, Junseo and his wife, who had turned out to share Imani's interest in textile design and had become something unexpectedly close to a friend, Daewon, who ate more than anyone and said less, and Imani's sister Anaya, who had flown in from Atlanta for 2 weeks and had spent the first 3 days cataloging Tae-hyun with the systematic suspicion of a woman who had spent 31 years as the person responsible for Imani's emotional safety. By the 4th day, Anaya had revised her position. Not because Tae-hyun had performed warmth or made speeches. He hadn't. He was still precise, still measured, still the kind of man who communicated more with a single look than other men managed in full sentences. But Anaya had watched him pass her sister the salt before she asked for it, and refill her water glass without being asked, and listen, actually listen, with the full weight of his attention, not the social performance of listening, when she talked about a new collection she was developing. She had watched him do these things without awareness that he was being observed, without the self-consciousness of a man performing adequacy. And she had told Imani privately, in the kitchen while they made coffee, "He sees you." Imani had said, "I know." Anaya had said, "Does he know what that means? That you've been waiting to be seen like that for a really long time?" Imani had looked through the kitchen doorway to where Tae-hyun was sitting at the dinner table listening to Hyun-jae say something that was clearly a criticism and clearly a form of love, and tolerating it with the particular weary patience of a man who had decided the door would stay open. "I think he's figuring it out," she said. At the end of the dinner, Hyun-jae stood to leave first. He always left first, the habit of a man who had chaired enough tables to understand that the host's evening belonged to the host once the formal arc was complete. He shook hands with Junseo, nodded to Daewon, was charming to Anaya in a formal and slightly antique way that made her visibly uncertain whether to be suspicious or flattered. Then he stopped at Imani's chair. She looked up at him. The old man who had arranged a marriage like a business proposal and run an operation like a proof, and sat in a chair in his house and said the most honest thing he'd ever said to his son in the least direct way available to him. "You make good food," he said. It was not an apology. It was not a declaration. It was Kang Hyun-jae at the full extent of what he could offer, delivered plainly, without performance. She received it the same way. "Thank you for coming," she said. He left. Tae-hyun appeared at her shoulder a moment later, collecting glasses from the table, and she heard him exhale. Small, controlled, the sound of a man choosing to be at peace with the shape of what was available rather than the grief of what wasn't. She put her hand on his arm briefly as she passed. He caught her hand for a second, held it, let go. Later, after the guests were gone, and the kitchen was clean and Anaya was asleep in the guest room and the city was doing its quiet late-night thing below the windows, Imani sat in the studio room under the north light with a new sheet of paper and thought about what to draw. She looked at the finished piece on the wall, the one she'd completed during the storm, him in the doorway with the wall down, the truest thing she'd ever made of him. She picked up the charcoal, and she started drawing something new. Not his back turned to a window, not his profile across a crowded room, not the loneliness she'd seen first, the thing that had made her look twice and then 100 times more. She drew his hands. The way they looked at the kitchen sink, still, unhurried, belonging to the room. In the hallway outside the studio door, she heard him stop. She heard him recognize that she was there and still awake, and she heard him decide, quietly, without announcement, not to pass by. He knocked. "Come in," she said. He leaned in the doorway, still in his dinner clothes, looking at her at the work table under the light. She looked back. He saw the new sheet, the beginning of something, and he looked at it for a moment with an expression she had spent 3 years trying to find the name for. It was, she understood now, simply this: a man allowing himself to be seen without the cost being more than he could pay. "Come sit," she said. She nodded to the chair in the corner. He came in. He sat down. She drew, and he stayed. He stayed, and the city moved beneath them, and that was enough. That was, in fact, everything. There are stories that end with grand gestures, proposals on riverbanks, speeches to crowded rooms, the public performance of transformation for an audience that needs the confirmation. This story had some of that, later. The Han River at dusk, a ring that was not ostentatious, a city that had watched a cold and powerful man become something more complicated and more real, and found it, to its own surprise, worth watching. But the true ending was here, in this room. Two imperfect people who had walked into a transaction and found something they hadn't budgeted for and had chosen, repeatedly and without fanfare, to stay inside it. Not because it was easy. Not because either of them had become someone different, but because the version of themselves that existed in that room, unguarded, unpolished, genuinely known, was the best version, the one worth protecting. The charcoal moved across the paper, his hands, still, belonging to the room. Outside, Soul went on. But in here, everything that needed to be true was true, and that was where they lived.